Let me ask you a question. What is Mascot Horror? I mean, it seems obvious, right? This is Mascot Horror, this is Mascot Horror, and this too. But how do we know that? What is it about all of these games that define them all as part of the Mascot Horror genre? All these games vary in so many different ways, but what is the secret ingredient that classifies them all together? This is a question that has plagued the communities around these works as well as me for a while now, and it seems like nobody can really agree on a solid answer. At least in my eyes. Sometimes some people claim they have a proper definition to it all, but almost every single time I see holes in what they categorize it all in and find exceptions that disprove their entire points. It's kind of to the point of being so difficult to define and so annoying to watch people incorrectly explain that I just need to go ahead and go out of my way and at least try to give my 2 cents on what makes a mascot horror game a mascot horror game. So that's what I'm going to try and do today. I want to try my best to create a proper definition of what the heck a mascot horror game even is, or at least what it should be. I'll try to cover as many different ideas as I can to allow equal representation, and in turn I'll try to also single out the key factors I feel are vital to the genre as a whole. Without further delay, let's just go ahead and get this over with already. Now, to start things off, I feel like in order to properly define what mascot horror even is, I'll first have to properly point out what it isn't, or more specifically, what it isn't necessarily. By that, I mean I want to go ahead and debunk some common misconceptions people tend to have when it comes to this topic, and ultimately use that information as the foundation of my definition. So let's talk about that already. Misconception number 1, the game/game series has to have merch. Now, I see a lot of people commonly make this claim when it comes to defining mascot horror, and typically argue that in order for something to be classified as mascot horror, it needs to have some kind of merchandise in some shape or form. That is stupid. For starters, a game should always be defined and classified and categorized by the actual game itself, not by the people or products around it. Secondly, you can't just say things are mascot horror because it has merch, because there are so many other horror games, heck games in general, that have merch that are far from being mascot horror. Lastly, you're telling me if these games right here didn't have merch, they wouldn't be fitting the criteria of mascot horror game? That's silly. These works are literally what define the genre in the first place, and claiming that their title solely derives from whether or not the creator wanted to capitalize or not belittles and ignores what makes them unique in the first place. Let me give a quick example. Relatively recently, a new mascot horror game by the name of Indigo Park was released by the creator Uniqueys, and playing it for the first time was a very charming experience. The game had fun, silly characters, interesting, charming environments, and although needing some attention here and there, it's a piece of work that I believe has massive potential. Now you might be asking, why am I bringing this up? Well, I was actually one of the few people who looked forward to the game's release back when it was first announced. I'd always get stupidly excited when a trailer or potentially a Q&A video released, and I loved hearing about Uniqueys' mindset during the process. They were asked a lot of questions about the game, and Mason was happy to answer, though one of the questions they were asked the most was whether or not the game would get any merch at all. And you know what Mason, Uniqueys, the man, the myth, the legend himself said? Nah. They wanted to rather focus their efforts on actually making a good game instead of dealing with all that stuff right now, especially since the game hadn't even came out yet. Right here, this alone is amazing proof that mascot horror doesn't need merchandise to define it. Now, eventually, Indigo Park did actually get some merchandise, but technically, to be fair, that's because so many people were just begging Mason to make a Rambly plush. So technically, I'm still right. I'm still right, and I'm going to keep that point. I'm going to keep that argument. Anyways, let's go to our next misconception. Number 2, the game/game series has to be for kids and or kid-friendly. This is absolutely incorrect. A mascot horror game, heck, just games in general, shouldn't need to cater to any specific audience in order for it to be part of the genre. Sure, those games and even genres may have a specific demographic of people who typically enjoy them, commonly indulging in similar works, but that doesn't mean those people are the only people who like those type of games. Stereotyping groups of people onto various pieces of work is not only insulting to the actual communities around them, but also insulting to the games themselves. Allow me to give another example. Ever since the first chapter of Poppy Playtime came out, a lot of people associated its communities with kids, and to be honest, that's fair because there are a lot of kids who like these games. But that being said, the game has changed a lot since that first chapter, and it's gotten to the point that deliberately calling it just for kids and only for kids is just wrong. The game is much more mature now, and Mob Entertainment made it that way for a reason, because their communities want it that way. Chapter 3 got so much praise for taking that step forward and submitting the series as something more than just a stupid kid game. And to just ignore all that effort and passion is just spitting in the faces of the people who made it happen. Misconception number 3, and our last misconception of the entire video. The game/game series has to have an in-universe mascot in order for it to count. Now, this is a bit debatable, and ultimately it kind of just comes down to what you see yourself as Mascot Horror, but I'm gonna still try and explain why I believe that having an in-universe mascot isn't necessarily needed to be considered Mascot Horror. And I know that sounds stupid because it's literally called Mascot Horror, but just hear me out. What kind of games do you actually consider, without needing a definition of any kind, Mascot Horror? Obviously the typical ones come to mind: FNAF, Poppy, Bendy. Those ones are pretty self-explanatory, but how many of you guys said Hello Neighbor or Baldi? For me, I definitely consider these Mascot Horror games without even needing a definition of any kind, just because they scream that vibe. But neither of these have mascots as their main selling points, instead of just having average everyday humans. So are these Mascot Horror? Once again, it ultimately comes down to what you see as fitting or not, but for me, I've been molding my definition just so I can fit these two. Saying Hello Neighbor doesn't fit into Mascot Horror doesn't sit right with me at all. Also, just because something isn't part of a brand in the universe doesn't mean it can't give off that Mascot Horror vibe. BanBan has been proving that for a while now. Now, you may be saying, oh, but Garnet BanBan takes place in a kindergarten. They are mascots of a brand. And you'd be right, but honestly, I say not really. Other than the first few games in the series, BanBan doesn't really revolve around that concept of a kindergarten anymore, and it kind of just does whatever it wants. Yet it's still considered Mascot Horror. Let me ask you this: if the first two games were never made and we only had the more recent ones to go off of, would it still be Mascot Horror? I say yes. So I think it's fair to say the same for other games that are similar and don't follow the more typical formula of having literal mascots as their main enemy. But anyways, those are all the major misconceptions I really wanted to talk about before dealing with the actual definition, because I feel like they desperately needed to be cleared up. Though, they also helped build up a nice sturdy foundation for us to continue, so let's do that. Definition Part 1. The games have to have horror aspects as their main selling points, or at least claim to be a horror experience. This should be obvious. I mean, it's called Mascot Horror for a reason, but sometimes these games tend to not really end up being too scary, so that's why I added the claim to be scary section. So, you're good, BanBan, don't worry. Definition Part 2. The characters/main monster is a suitable mascot for the game itself and content around it, similar to how Mario and Sonic represent their games. I believe this is the case because Mascot Horror always has some sort of main character that's used to represent its experience in some shape or form, whether that's a friendly little pal or the main monster itself. Think of characters like Freddy, Bendy, Huggy Wuggy, BanBan, Baldi, the Neighbor, Rambly, and many, many more. I could go on forever, but I'm not going to. The reason I compare these characters with those of Sonic and Mario is because they're what make their franchises unique and stand out. You're not playing a typical platformer where you play as an Italian plumber. No, you're playing a Mario game. Those are very different things, and it's the same way for Mascot Horror. That being said, I understand there are definitely horror games out there that have recognizable characters and monsters that define their franchises and are not Mascot Horror, or at least not considered that. But hopefully my next point can help weed out those imposters. Definition number 3. The game has to have a twist in expectations, turning something charming, innocent, or fun into something sinister, evil, or horrifying. Hopefully this will single out a lot more games that are actually Mascot Horror, because this is an idea that basically needs to be present in order for them to even work. Like I said prior, these games need to have an identity of some kind to make them stand out, but alongside that, these games also have to have a twist of expectations in some way. Emphasis on some way, because that can change depending on the game. For games like FNAF, Poppy, and Bendy, that twist is the corruption of childhood aspects or brands, while others can just showcase charming, recognizable characters that don't seem inherently scary at first, but are. For this rule, I really wanted to make sure I covered the twist idea that all these games have, and I specifically made sure it wasn't just it needs to have aspects of childhood being turned scary, because that's not all these works can do. It's absolutely possible for someone to make a Mascot Horror game without making it about any nostalgic topics at all, because games themselves can be about anything. Plus, Mascot Horror is a genre, and last time I checked, not every RPG goes the same direction. But anyways, with this new rule, we can instantly kick out any games that have recognizable horror enemies that don't derive from anything innocent or charming, which is really useful. Unfortunately though, the definition is still pretty weird and wonky, and there's most likely games that you would never consider Mascot Horror that still kind of fit into this list. So that's why I have my last, and probably what's going to be my most controversial and confusing rule. Let's get into it. Definition part 4. It's gotta pass the vibe check. This may sound silly, but just think about it. Really, truly, at the end of the day, are you seriously going to come out of this video using my definition as the proper way to sniff out any Mascot Horror games? Most likely not. Most of you probably don't even care. And I understand that, because who actually needs a definition? I know saying that kind of defeats the whole point of this video, but really, just because we can't define it perfectly doesn't mean we don't know what Mascot Horror is, because we do. Because we just know that vibe these games should give off. But that vibe itself is something so hard to describe because, like I said in the very beginning of this video, all of these games vary in so many different ways. For example, look at both of these. Both of these games feel like Mascot Horror and are put in the same genre as each other, but like, these could not be any more different from each other. But somehow, in the same way, you look at both of these equally and are like, man, that'll make good clickbait. Like, what? How can I even begin to understand why that is? I mean, so far, I think I've done a good job. My definition feels right to me so far, but what really is the point of making it if people are just gonna see a new game that comes out that looks like this, and just instantly call it Mascot Horror without needing a definition of any kind, and being absolutely spot on? There's just a vibe that all these games give off one way or another, and trust me, I really tried to figure out what that spark really was, but I just couldn't. But maybe that's okay. Maybe Mascot Horror is just cursed to be an internet term for the rest of existence. Or maybe, the true definition of Mascot Horror were the friends we made along the way. As Mr. Hippo once said, not every genre has to have significance. Sometimes a genre is just a genre. You try to read into every little thing and find meaning in everything everyone says, and you'll just drive yourself crazy. And honestly, I'd prefer to keep my sanity, so I think I'm gonna stop here. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and if you have anything to say about my definition, whether good or bad, please let me know in the comments because I'd love to hear your takes. But anyways, I guess I'll see y'all later. Bye.